Hello and welcome to the second Olympus iSpeed Labs. My name's Chris Robinson and today I'd like to talk to you about some of the more advanced features of the Olympus iSpeed 3 camera. I'm going to start with the concept of motion blur and speed and shutter and how these things interact with each other. You can think of shutter as the camera opening its eyes to take a photograph and then closing its eyes again. So if I make an example of the camera at a fairly low frame rate and a long shutter, you'll see that it opens its eyes for quite a long time, closes and reopens in order to use a long shutter. If we now move to a short shutter time, but we keep the same frame speed, you'll see that the camera is only opening its eyes briefly. So this is an example of a short shutter. If now we keep that same short shutter and we go to a fast frame speed, you can see that the camera's opening and closing its eyes very quickly. So it's taking a lot of photographs per second, but only for a very brief period of time per photo. Well, that's the theory, but what actually does that do? I have some examples that I'd like to show you. So we took some footage of a car at 60 frames a second and at a shutter of ×1. You can see what's happened. The car has moved through quite quickly. Let's play that again and freeze in the middle. And there you can see the car is really quite blurred. This is motion blur and it's caused because we have a long shutter. Let's now look and see what happens at the same frame speed, still 60 frames a second, but with a ×20 shutter. The car moves by at the same speed, but if I rewind and stop it in the middle, you'll see that the car is absolutely perfect. This is what your short shutter does for you. It removes motion blur. Let's now look at what happens when we have a high frame speed. I'll just move the car a bit further into the shot here before I start to play. There we go, you can see what's happening. The car appears to be moving much more slowly. That's the effect of frame speed. And because I have a fast shutter as well, you can see that the car is absolutely perfect. One question that customers often ask me is, how do I trigger on an unpredictable event? Well, this is all about the memory inside the camera. So shown here in red is the internal circular buffer. When you're recording at high speed, your video goes into this buffer. But when you switch the camera off, that buffer empties, it's volatile. So if you want to keep your video, you have to record it into a compact flash card, which is located here in the camera. So how does this circular buffer work? Well, let me show you. The camera records into its memory like this. When it gets to the end of the memory, it seamlessly jumps back to the beginning. So you could regard it as a circle. So the camera begins to record, and when it gets to the end, it jumps to the beginning and then overwrites what it's just recorded. And it will continue doing this all day. And this is why we call it a circular buffer. And it will continue until the user presses the trigger. And at that point, the camera will carry on until it's got halfway round its buffer, then it will stop. And then when you take the buffer and you put it into the player, that part of the buffer goes to the beginning, this part of the buffer goes to the end, and the trigger point goes in the middle. So the camera effectively has taken a few seconds of history before the trigger and a few seconds of future after the trigger. This is called normal trigger. But the iSpeed 3 has two other trigger modes. There's record on command and burst record on command. With record on command, when you press the trigger switch, the camera will start to record. And when you release the trigger switch, the camera will stop recording. Press it, it records, release, it stops. Press, release, and so on until you've run out of memory. When you come to play this back, each of the press start points and release end points will appear as bookmarks in the player. And this is really useful if you've got something that happens randomly and you want to get several shots in one take and you're there to press the trigger button. Burst record on command works like this. The camera will record when the trigger button is pressed, but only for a set period of time that the user sets, and then it will stop. Next time the event occurs, the button is pressed, the camera will record and stop, and so on, until it's run out of memory. Burst record on command is useful if you've got something that happens randomly, but it's detected by some kind of detector that can trigger the camera and make it perform this recording. Once again, the trigger points appear in the player as bookmarks. So far, we've looked at triggering using a pickle switch or by having something connected to the camera. But supposing you haven't got something to connect to the camera and you can't be there to press your trigger switch. What can you do about that? Well, the iSpeed 3 has a system called Video Trigger, which means that it can look at the video images and see if something's changed and then trigger on that. The system has 3 active areas, which you can vary in size and you can vary in position. And you can also adjust sensitivity. And it works by looking at the average brightness over the active area. So that if the area is dark and suddenly it becomes light, the camera will trigger, or vice versa. The system, however, only works at 30 frames a second. So for example, you wouldn't use it to catch a cricket ball flying past the camera. On the other hand, you could look at the cricket bat, and when it moves out of position, then that would definitely cause a trigger. Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk to you about is sync. To do that, I need some cameras. I'll go and get them. So we've seen that trigger is used to stop the camera, and synchronization is used to cause cameras to take pictures at exactly the same time. You might want to do this if you're using a 3D rig, or perhaps you're trying to do 3D analysis, or car crash testing, for example. This system works between 24 frames a second and 150,000 frames a second, and will lock the two cameras together accurate to about 50 nanoseconds. The exposure time in the slave camera is measured in time units, seconds, microseconds, rather than in X or ratio units as the master normally would be. I've set this camera to run at 400 frames a second. I've set this camera to run much slower, but I've set it up so that it gets a really good picture at 400 frames a second, just to show you the synchronization in operation. All I have to do is take sync out from this camera and connect it to sync in for this camera. And you'll see now that this camera has a perfect image, and if you look closely at the CDU, you'll see that this is also running at 400 frames a second, and you'll see that the sync flag is displayed. So let's see that moment again as the right-hand camera comes into lock. So in this session, we've looked at the advanced features of the iSpeed 3 camera. We've looked at shutter, speed, the circular buffer. We've looked at trigger, which is used to stop the camera. We've looked at synchronization, which is used to get two cameras to take pictures at exactly the same time. Thank you very much indeed for watching, and please join me on the next iSpeed Labs.